All right, we're looking at the minor prophets, and today we're beginning the book of Habakkuk. And this isn't a book you hear a whole lot about, but like all the rest of the minor prophets, it's pretty amazing. You know, every time I start one of these minor prophets, I sort of think, it's going to be so hard. What's here? This is a challenge. And yet by the end, I'm always thinking, wow, this is such a powerful and absolutely life-transforming book. And really, it's true of each and every one. Obadiah, it's like God is faithful to his promises. And Joel teaches us all about repentance and even God's great future work. And Amos describes the justice of God's judgment. And Jonah shows us the compassion of God. And Hosea, the love of God. And Micah, how God has a plan even when it looks like he doesn't have a plan. Nahum pictures God as this great warrior and gives us comfort that God can defeat his enemies. And Zephaniah shows us the future plans of God and even how behind God's judgment there's something beautiful. And Habakkuk is no different. In fact, in some ways, I feel like it might be one of the most relevant of all the minor prophets. While obviously it's only a short book, it's 3 chapters, its message is so important and so relevant for us. We all suffer, and we suffer from a lot of different burdens. We feel weighed down, and I wonder what you feel burdened about. Habakkuk has something to say to those of you who are burdened. There are lots of personal burdens we carry around. But I wonder if you ever step back and just look at the state of the world and feel a sense of burden. Everything seems so chaotic sometimes, especially right now. And obviously, looking at this world and the way things work, it can be confusing, and we start to ask questions like, is God in control? Or does he even know what's going on down here? And if he does, why are things happening the way that they're happening? And that's part of the purpose of Habakkuk. Sometimes as we look at the world and we look at what's happening, we find ourselves beginning to ask questions of God. And it's easy to just say, don't ask questions of God. But we do ask questions of God. And how do we work through this? How do we process this? We can learn from Habakkuk. It's a very different kind of book. Most of the time, prophets are bringing God's revelation to God's people. But this time, Habakkuk is the prophet who's bringing his own questions to God. And mostly this book is a prophet interacting with God, and he's asking God questions, and God is answering, and then the prophet is responding. And the essence of what Habakkuk has to teach us as we deal with these burdens and look to God is how we process what's going on, how we understand, how we can think about what's going on. And his starting point is found in Habakkuk 2, verse 4. Someone said, it's not every book of the Bible that you can summarize with one verse, but Habakkuk, really you can, and not just the whole verse even, the second half of the verse. The righteous shall live by faith. And that's important. In a sense, that's really the summary of the entire Old Testament. What's the Old Testament about? The righteous shall live by faith. It's intended to teach you that. Someone once said, Moses gave Israel 613 commandments. David reduced them to 10. Isaiah to 2. But Habakkuk to 1. The righteous shall live by faith. And certainly this is at the heart of the New Testament as well. It's quoted over and over. And some have said this is actually the verse that led to the Reformation. It's the theme verse of the Reformation. Habakkuk 2:4. The righteous shall live by faith. Now, Habakkuk is mentioned nowhere else in the Old Testament, the name, the prophet. And he doesn't say exactly when he was writing. As scholars have looked at the book, it seems like he was writing a little while after the fall of Nineveh to the Babylonians in 612 and before the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians in 587 BC. So a little bit of context. He's talking to Judah. Obviously, you remember Israel was divided into 2 kingdoms, the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, and the northern kingdom had fallen at this point. And the southern kingdom, their last good king, whose name was Josiah, has died. Habakkuk was probably born during the reign of Josiah. And of course, we know Josiah was a great king, one of the best kings that ever lived. Some have said Hezekiah was a second David and Josiah was a second Moses, because he found the book of the law and he tried to make great reforms based on what he read there. 2 Chronicles 34, 3-7 describes what happened during Josiah's reign. In the 8th year of his reign, while he was still young, he began to seek the God of his father David. In the 12th year, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of high places, Asherah poles, carved idols, and cast images. Under his direction, the altar of the Baals were torn down. He cut to pieces the incense altars that were above them and smashed the Asherah poles, the idols, and the images. These he broke to pieces and scattered over the graves of those who had sacrificed to them. He burned the bones of the priests on their altars, and so he purged or cleansed Judah and Jerusalem and the towns of Manasseh, Ephraim, and Simeon, as far as Naphtali, and in the ruins around them. He tore down the altars and the Asherah poles and crushed the idols to powder and cut to pieces all the incense altars throughout Israel. So this is big. I mean, we really haven't heard of a king doing this kind of thing for a while, if ever. But these reforms were not good enough. The people, Judah, they were too far gone. And so it's almost like the bus has gone off the cliff and Josiah is the bus driver trying to turn the bus around after it's already falling off the cliff. It's too late. And so even though there were these external reforms, these reforms were not comprehensive or intensive enough because Josiah couldn't get to people's hearts. And that was always the problem. They needed a heart change. And even ultimately, his own heart had its own problems as well. You remember Josiah was ruling during the reign of Assyria, but Assyria was beginning to crumble and Nineveh was defeated. Egypt and the king of Egypt was traveling through Palestine to help Assyria fight against Babylon. They were allies, and Josiah goes out to stop the king of Egypt. We don't know why. Perhaps because he had made some alliance with Babylon. And even as he goes out, God tries to stop Josiah by sending a prophet from battling this king of Egypt, but he wouldn't listen, Josiah. And so, even though he was a godly king, he really didn't listen to God at this point, and he dies. And the people take one of Josiah's sons and try to make him king, but the king of Egypt says no and takes him off the throne. He puts his brother as king in his place and even names him to show that he is in charge. The Pharaoh names him Jehoiakim, and the chronicler summarizes his rule very simply. And he reigned for 11 years in Jerusalem. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord his God. So you see, the people were way too far gone. Josiah dies, they start doing evil almost immediately. And he was a wicked king, and the people just followed him. They followed in his footsteps. And it seems kind of like, when a person's just going through the motions of being a Christian for a long time, and then for some reason the restraints are taken off, they sometimes go crazy. I heard of someone recently who for a long time was saying he was a Christian, but where there were all these questions. Is this guy a Christian? Is this guy not a Christian? And then something happened, and it was like the seatbelt was taken off, and his true heart came out, and he was just running after sin as hard as he could. And that's kind of what happened after the death of Josiah. The people of Judah just go after sin hard. And it is breaking Habakkuk's heart. Because Habakkuk is a godly man. And he's looking at all this depravity, and it becomes a burden to him. So the first verse is so appropriate, Habakkuk 1:1. The oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw, and you could translate that word oracle, burden, because this is a burden. So many other prophets have been talking about judgment almost from God's perspective. God's bringing this judgment. Now Habakkuk's helping us look at it from the other angle, from the perspective of a godly person who's in the middle of all this depravity, and he's trying to process through this whole idea, what in the world is God doing? And he begins, honestly, by complaining. Chapter 1, Habakkuk complains. Chapter 2, Habakkuk begins to change. And then chapter 3, Habakkuk praises God. So complaining, changing, praising. That's the structure of this book. And yet he begins by complaining, verses 2-4 of chapter 1. And this is Habakkuk's complaint. How long shall I cry and you will not hear? And he says, why, O God, do I look around and I see all this wickedness? And yet, God, it seems like you're doing Nothing. Absolutely nothing. How long shall I cry for help and you will not hear, or cry to you violence and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed and justice never goes forth, for the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. And so you can just try to analyze this from Habakkuk's perspective. God seems silent. He needs help, and God does nothing. The problems around him are serious. There's violence. You can imagine the fear of living in a culture like this. And it doesn't seem like God will save. He knows God's able to save, but it seems like God doesn't want to. And look at the conditions around Habakkuk. There's iniquity, there's wrong, there's destruction, there's violence, there's strife, there's contention. The law is paralyzed, justice never goes forth. The wicked surround the righteous, justice is perverted. You try to think about that. What has Habakkuk seen? He's seen people hurt other people. He's seen someone get abused, and those who are supposed to do something about it don't care. He's seen the rich take advantage of the poor, and the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And what's the problem here for Habakkuk as he sees all of this? The problem is, it seems like he cares more about it than God does. Why do you make me see iniquity? And why do you idly look at wrong? That's pretty intense. In fact, what do you think about what he says there? Is that a okay way to talk to God? It's something we see other writers of Scripture asking for sure, like Psalm chapter 10, verse 1. Why, O Lord, do you stand far away? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? We see it in Psalm 73 as well. Obviously, it's possible to ask these kinds of questions wrongly, as if you were God, as if you were wiser than God, as if you were more just than God. But is it possible to ask these kinds of questions in faith? I think for sure it is. It's called lament. It's right for us to lament. As we lament, one of the things we're saying is, God, this world is not the way it should be. Sin is devastating. I hate sin. In a sense, lamenting is a reverse way of praying, thy kingdom come. It's sort of the negative form. The positive statement is, thy kingdom come. Lament is, oh Lord, I long for your kingdom. Habakkuk's question is basically, God, why aren't you doing anything? And what is God's answer? Chapter 1, verses 5 through 11. God's answer is, I am doing something. Look among the nations and see, God says, wonder and be astounded, for I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if I told you. Now that's pretty awesome, isn't it? From Habakkuk's perspective, it looks like God is totally silent, and God is totally not doing anything. But the opposite is true. Specifically, as Habakkuk is looking around him in Israel, it feels like God isn't doing anything in Israel, and God tells Habakkuk, because of all that's happening in Israel, he's actually doing a work in the nations. You're going to have to look outside of Israel to the nations and see what I'm doing, and it's actually something pretty terrible, something pretty frightening, something pretty awe-inspiring. What's he doing? Verse 6. Look, I'm raising up the Chaldeans. Chaldeans are the Babylonians. The land of Israel is located in something we call Palestine. The land of Babylon is located in something we call Chaldea. God is raising up the Chaldeans, and the Babylonians are beginning to rise to power. You remember Assyria for a long time had been the dominant nation. But we're beginning to hear more and more about Babylon, and God's telling Habakkuk, I'm the one behind it. And what's that teaching us about God? It's teaching us that God is sovereign over the nations. As one man has put it, every nation on earth is under the hand of God, for there is no power in this world that is not ultimately controlled by him. Things are not what they appear to be. It seems to be the astute military prowess of the Chaldeans that had brought them up into power, but it was not so at all, for God had raised them up. God is the Lord of history. He is seated in the heavens, and the nations are to him as grasshoppers, as a drop in a bucket, or as the small dust of the balance. The Bible asserts that God is over all. He started the historical process. He is controlling the historical process, and he is going to end the historical process. We must never lose sight of this crucial fact. God is working, Martin Lloyd-Jones says, even when you don't think he's working. History is under control. History follows the divine plan. History follows the divine timetable. History is bound up with the kingdom of God. How long? Habakkuk says. God says, not long. Not long. He's raising up Babylon to take care of the wickedness and violence in Judah by bringing punishment. And yet this doesn't seem like the kind of nation where you would think God is working. Habakkuk describes them as bitter, as hasty, as greedy, as violent, as dreaded, as fearsome, and as proud of themselves. They are unstoppable, and he uses some images in verses 8 and 9 to describe how unstoppable. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Verse 10, he describes their motivations. They're greedy. At kings they scoff. They're proud. At rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. They come for violence. They love violence. And then he says, they are self-idolaters. Then they sweep by like the wind and go on, verse 11, guilty men whose own might is their God. So basically what you have is Habakkuk struggling with violence in Israel and saying, God, this nation's so wicked. Why don't you care? And God says, Habakkuk, look at this other violent nation doing all this violence. I am planning on using them to accomplish my purposes. So basically, God has just taken Habakkuk's question and made it harder. How do you think Habakkuk was wanting God to answer? I think revival. God says no, judgment from a wicked nation. What sometimes happens when you ask a question of God is that he makes that question harder. And yet, he's God. And as we've already learned from Zephaniah, so often, the way God works, while it is sometimes confusing to us, we can know for sure that there is a great mind behind this plan. And God works through judgment to accomplish something beautiful. And in the rest of Habakkuk, we're going to see how God helps Habakkuk come to process that and understand that.